plan was to walk away clean with his severed ties, while I spent the rest of my remaining years rotting in a federal penitentiary. My cell phone screen suddenly illuminated my shaking hands. It was a single encrypted text message from Matthew. The bright light was dangerously revealing in the dark attic, so I quickly shielded the screen against my chest. The message read, "Stay put. They have local cops on the payroll. I am flying in immediately." I stared at the glowing green words. Matthew had been building a massive federal case against this specific financial syndicate for 2 straight years. He must have recognized Travis on a wiretap or a surveillance log late tonight. He realized his own brother-in-law was the ruthless cartel cleaner his agency had been hunting. Down below, Travis zipped the heavy duffel bag shut. He picked up a small black USB drive from the dining table. I watched him walk out of the living room and step directly into my adjoining study. I crawled carefully along the attic beam, tracking his path, until I found another gap above the study ceiling. Travis booted up my personal desktop computer. The bright blue light washed over his smug, arrogant face. He inserted the drive and rapidly typed a complex series of commands. He was planting the final lethal piece of evidence. This specific drive would contain all the illegal routing numbers, the offshore ledgers, and the fake communication logs permanently tying my name to the cartel operations. Once the digital transfer was complete, he did not take the drive with him. He pulled it from the computer tower and deliberately wedged it deep behind my heavy oak bookshelf. He placed it exactly where a corrupt police raid would easily find it during a targeted search. He then took a microfiber cloth from his pocket and wiped down the keyboard to remove his fingerprints. Satisfied with his treason, he walked over to my corner liquor cabinet, poured himself a small glass of my most expensive scotch, and smiled at his reflection in the window. He was celebrating his brilliant victory. He was toasting to my absolute destruction. I spent the next 4 hours sitting in the pitch-black attic listening to the house settle. The initial paralyzing shock faded away entirely, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. I was not going to be a helpless victim. I was not going to let this arrogant suit-wearing criminal destroy my family and steal my hard-earned freedom. I mentally inventoried every device in my home. I tracked his daily schedule in my head. Travis left for his downtown office at 8 every morning. Rachel had her yoga class at 9. That gave me a critical window of complete isolation. I needed to access his secure files before the corrupt raid hit my front door. I knew he kept a biometric safe bolted to the floor in his bedroom closet. I needed a way into that safe. I spent my entire professional life designing complex systems to withstand massive, crushing pressure. Travis thought he had built an inescapable, flawless trap, but he made one critical, fatal miscalculation. He assumed the foundation he was standing on was blind, fragile, and weak. I spent those 4 dark hours mapping out my exact counterstrike. By the time the sun began to rise over the jagged Colorado mountains, my fear was completely gone. I was ready to tear his entire operation to the ground. I did not gasp. Panic is a luxury you cannot afford when the foundation of your life is collapsing. I relied on 40 years of engineering discipline. I slowed my breathing, matching the rhythm of the central air conditioning unit humming in the corner of the attic. I reached into my pajama pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I swiped the screen with a trembling thumb, double-checking that the device was completely silenced. I opened the camera application, switched to the video function, and pressed the red record button. I pushed the lens directly against the rough edge of the floorboard gap. I zoomed in on the stacks of $100 bills. I made sure the camera captured the exact make and model of the suppressed handgun. Most importantly, I focused the lens on my son-in-law. I needed his face. I needed the cold, calculating expression he wore as he orchestrated my absolute ruin. Down below, Travis zipped the heavy black duffel bag shut. The metallic sound echoed loudly in the quiet house. He picked up the bag and a small black flash drive from the dining table. He walked out of the living room and turned down the hallway toward my private study. I lost visual contact. I knew I had to follow him, but the attic floor above the hallway was unfloored. It was nothing but exposed wooden joists and thick pink fiberglass insulation. One wrong step would send my foot crashing through the drywall ceiling below, instantly alerting a man armed with a silenced weapon. I got down on my hands and knees. I am 62 years old, and my joints ache when the weather turns cold, but adrenaline is a powerful painkiller. I crawled slowly, placing my weight perfectly across the load-bearing beams. I navigated the dark expanse until I reached the air conditioning vent, located directly above my study. I peered through the metal grates. Travis was sitting in my heavy leather desk chair. He reached under the desk and booted up my desktop computer. The large monitor flickered to life, casting a harsh blue glow across his face. I watched him insert the black flash drive into the front port of the computer tower. His fingers flew across my keyboard with practiced, terrifying speed. He was opening command prompts and running complex background programs. In that exact moment, the final piece of the puzzle violently snapped into place. Just last month, Travis had insisted on upgrading my home internet network. He claimed it was a generous gift. He spent an entire weekend running thick Ethernet cables from the street directly into my study. He installed a high-capacity server rack in the corner of the room, claiming his accounting firm required a military-grade connection for him to work from home on the weekends. I had thanked him. I had even bought him a beer while we worked. I realize now that the server rack was never for his accounting firm. It was a dedicated proxy server. He was actively routing illegal offshore cartel transactions directly through my personal internet protocol address. Worse than that, he was weaponizing my life savings. He had offered to consolidate my retirement accounts earlier this year, claiming he could get me a better yield on my pension and the life insurance policy my wife had left behind. I had given him full access. He was using those accounts as temporary holding cells to wash massive amounts of illicit syndicate money. When the authorities finally noticed the millions of dollars moving through the dark web, the digital trail would lead straight to my house, straight to my computer, and straight to my bank accounts. My phone suddenly vibrated in the palm of my hand. The sudden movement nearly caused me to drop it through the vent. I pulled the device back and looked at the screen. It was a single text message from my oldest son, Matthew. I read the words glowing in the dark. Stay put. They have local cops on the payroll. I am flying in. The chilling reality of those words paralyzed me for a moment. I could not simply call 911. The police officers who patrolled my quiet suburban neighborhood, the men and women I waved to at the grocery store, were corrupted. They were on the cartel payroll. If I called for help, the dispatcher would alert Travis. A patrol car would arrive, and I would be quietly eliminated during a fabricated resisting arrest scenario. Matthew was my only lifeline, but he was stationed halfway across the country. I was entirely alone in the house with a predator. I looked back down through the metal vent. Travis had finished his digital transfer. He did not remove the flash drive to take it with him. Instead, he pulled it from the computer and stood up. He walked over to the massive oak bookshelf that lined the far wall of my study. I had built that bookshelf myself 20 years ago. Travis reached behind the third shelf, slipping the small black drive into the narrow gap between the wood and the drywall. He was planting the evidence. He was putting it exactly where the corrupt local police would miraculously find it during their orchestrated raid tomorrow morning. He walked back to my desk and pulled a microfiber cloth from his suit jacket. He meticulously wiped down the keyboard, the mouse, and the power button, erasing any physical trace of his presence in the room. Then he did something that ignited a white-hot rage in my chest. He walked over to my private liquor cabinet. He opened the glass doors and pulled out a bottle of 20-year-old single malt scotch. It was a rare bottle my late wife had given me for our 30th wedding anniversary. I only drank it on special occasions. Travis poured a generous amount into a crystal glass. He took a slow, satisfied sip, savoring the taste. He leaned back against my desk, looking around the room with a smug, victorious smile. He was completely satisfied with his treason. He believed he had executed the perfect crime. He drank my scotch while standing on the grave he had just dug for me. Travis rinsed the glass in the bathroom sink, grabbed his duffel bag, and quietly walked up the stairs to the guest bedroom where my daughter was sleeping. I heard the door click shut. The house plunged back into absolute silence. The thermostat clicked off. The temperature in the attic began to drop rapidly, the cold autumn air seeping through the roof vents. I did not move. I spent the next 4 hours sitting in the pitch-black attic. My legs went completely numb, and the fiberglass dust burned my lungs, but my mind was operating with crystal clarity. I was no longer an old man hiding in the dark. I was a structural engineer evaluating a flawed blueprint. Travis had built a complex digital and physical trap, but every structure has a weak point. Every system has a load-bearing pillar that, if removed, causes the entire thing to collapse inward. I sat in the darkness and mentally mapped out every asset I still controlled. I reviewed the layout of his home office. I analyzed the timeline Matthew had given me. Travis thought I was a naive, obsolete fool. He assumed I would simply wake up tomorrow, drink my coffee, and blindly walk into a federal prison cell. He was wrong. By the time the first rays of morning light filtered through the wooden slats of the attic, I was no longer afraid. I had finished calculating my exact counterstrike. I was going to tear his life apart. Dawn broke washing my bedroom in a pale, deceptive light. I had climbed down from the attic an hour earlier, my joints stiff and aching from the cold, unyielding wooden beams. I forced myself to take a hot shower, letting the steam loosen my rigid muscles. I stood under the spray and practiced my expression in the fogged mirror. I could not show a single trace of the cold fury boiling inside my chest. I had to be the man I was yesterday. I had to project the image of a tired, oblivious old man who trusted his family implicitly. I put on my worn denim jeans and a faded flannel shirt, the exact uniform of a retired engineer with absolutely nothing to hide and nowhere important to be. I walked out of my bedroom and descended the carpeted stairs at my usual deliberate pace. The house smelled of expensive dark roast coffee and toasted bagels. It was the scent of a perfectly normal suburban morning. I could hear the water running in the upstairs bathroom, which meant my daughter Rachel was getting ready for her day. I reached the bottom of the stairs and turned into the kitchen. My son-in-law was sitting at the massive granite island. He was dressed in a pristine charcoal gray suit, his silk tie perfectly knotted. He looked like the cover of a corporate magazine. He was sipping from a ceramic mug and calmly scrolling through the financial news on his silver tablet. There was absolutely no tension in his shoulders. There were no dark circles under his eyes. A man who had just framed his wife's father for a massive federal crime should look nervous. He should be sweating. But Travis just looked relaxed. He possessed the terrifying ability to completely compartmentalize his soul. He heard my footsteps and looked up from his glowing screen. He offered me a warm, practiced smile. He told me good morning and asked how I slept. His voice was incredibly smooth, dripping with manufactured affection. I forced my facial muscles to return the smile. I walked over to the coffee maker, grabbed my favorite mug, and poured myself a cup. I told him I slept straight through the night, blaming the crisp autumn air for knocking me out. I kept my back to him as I stirred my cream, taking a deep breath to steady my racing heart. I wanted to smash the heavy ceramic mug directly into his perfect teeth, but I maintained my engineering discipline. I turned around and leaned against the counter. Travis reached into his expensive leather briefcase resting on the stool next to him. He pulled out a thick manila folder and pushed it across the smooth granite surface toward me. He took a sip of his coffee and told me he needed a quick favor before he headed into the city for work. He claimed his accounting firm had found a minor discrepancy in my property tax filings from last year. He explained it was nothing to worry about, just a standard municipal delay, but he needed my signature on a tax extension form to prevent the city from issuing a late penalty. He was so incredibly convincing. If I had not spent the entire night watching him pack cartel blood money into a duffel bag, I would have thanked him for being so diligent. I picked up the folder and opened it. The top sheet was exactly what he claimed it was. It was a standard state tax extension form, complete with municipal logos and complex tax codes. But I did not stop at the first page. I pretended to struggle with the small print. I reached into my shirt pocket, pulled out my reading glasses, and slowly slid them onto my face. I licked my thumb and casually flipped to the second page, then the third. Hidden beneath the boring tax jargon was a densely worded legal document. It was an irrevocable power of attorney clause. It was completely comprehensive. It granted him total, unquestionable authority over my physical estate, my retirement accounts, my life insurance, and my medical decisions. The trap was breathtakingly vicious. He knew the federal raid was coming at 3 o'clock today. He knew I would be arrested, denied bail, and thrown into a holding cell. Once I was incarcerated and labeled a flight risk, he would take this signed document directly to the bank. He would legally seize every single penny I owned. He was planning to drain my life savings to pay back the cartel money he had stolen, leaving me completely penniless to fight a federal cyber extortion case. He was going to use my own money to buy his freedom. Travis tapped his expensive gold pen against the granite countertop. He told me his courier was waiting outside and he really needed me to sign the bottom line so he could get it filed before the courthouse closed. He was trying to rush me, applying mild pressure to prevent me from actually reading the words. I knew I could not refuse to sign. If I challenged him or threw the document back in his face, he would instantly realize his plan was compromised. He was an armed, desperate criminal with nothing to lose. I had to give him exactly what he wanted, but I had to render it completely useless. I looked at him over the rim of my reading glasses. I smiled and told him I always appreciated how well he took care of the boring paperwork for this family. I reached out and took the heavy gold pen from his fingers. I am naturally right-handed. Every check I have ever written, every architectural blueprint I have ever signed over the past 40 years was executed with my right hand. My signature is a distinct flowing script that my bank recognizes instantly. I placed the document flat on the kitchen island. I did not use my right hand. I smoothly transferred the heavy pen into my left hand. I planted my right hand firmly on the counter to support my weight, leaning over the paper. I placed the tip of the pen on the signature line. Writing with your non-dominant hand feels incredibly awkward, but that was exactly the point. I gripped the pen tightly and slowly dragged it across the paper. I intentionally exaggerated the unsteadiness. I made the loops jagged and asymmetrical. I forced the ink to stutter, creating a messy, unverified signature that looked like it belonged to an extremely frail man suffering from severe motor decline. It looked absolutely nothing like my legal signature on file at my trust. Any bank teller or legal notary would instantly flag it as a forgery or demand in-person verification. I lifted the pen. The fake signature sat boldly on the page. It was a masterpiece of sabotage. I capped the pen and tossed it onto the folder. I looked up at him and smiled broadly. I told him it was all done and ready to go. Travis did not even look closely at the signature. He was so blinded by his own arrogance that he simply assumed he had won. He snatched the folder off the counter with a hungry, rapid motion. He tucked it safely back into his leather briefcase and snapped the brass locks shut. He stood up from the stool, adjusting his silk tie. He told me I was a lifesaver and promised to bring home some good steaks for dinner tonight to celebrate the weekend. He was completely unaware that his legal safety net was absolutely worthless. He was walking out of my house holding a piece of garbage. Just then, the kitchen door swung open. Rachel walked in wearing her plush white bathrobe, a towel wrapped around her wet hair. She looked radiant and happy. She walked straight over to Travis and kissed him deeply on the cheek. She told him to have a wonderful day at the office. Travis wrapped his arm around her waist, kissed her forehead, and played the role of the devoted husband flawlessly. He looked over her shoulder, made eye contact with me, and gave me a respectful nod before walking out the front door. I listened to his luxury sedan start up in the driveway and pull away down the street. Rachel poured herself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter. She sighed happily and told me how lucky she was to find a man who worked so hard to take care of our family. I looked at my beautiful daughter, completely oblivious to the monster she had married. My heart broke for the pain she was going to endure today, but I could not hesitate. I rinsed my mug in the sink. I told her I had some errands to run and was heading out to the hardware store for some garden supplies. I grabbed my truck keys from the hook by the door. I had to meet Matthew. The real war was about to begin. I pulled my heavy truck out of the driveway, leaving my house behind like a ticking time bomb. I had told my daughter Rachel that I was heading to the local hardware store to buy winter mulch and heavy-duty trash bags for the garden. It was the perfect boring excuse for a retired man on a weekday morning. I drove down the familiar suburban streets, watching the neighborhood fully wake up. People were walking their golden retrievers and watering their pristine lawns. They waved at me as I passed by. They had absolutely no idea that a massive cartel money laundering operation was sitting right next door, humming quietly inside my private study. I checked my rearview mirror every few seconds, making sure I was not being followed by anyone from the corrupt local police precinct. I bypassed the local shopping centers and merged directly onto the interstate, pushing the heavy engine toward a neighboring town 20 miles away. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned completely white. The truck heater was blasting hot air onto my face, but I still felt the deep residual chill from the attic buried in my bones. I pulled into the gravel parking lot of a busy rundown diner situated right on the county line. It was the kind of place packed with long-haul truckers, overnight shift workers, and people who minded their own business. It was a place where nobody paid any attention to an old man coming in for a cup of black coffee. I walked through the smudged glass doors. The air inside was incredibly thick with the smell of fried bacon, burnt toast, and cheap maple syrup. The loud clatter of heavy silverware and the hum of a dozen overlapping conversations provided the perfect acoustic cover for a secure meeting. I scanned the crowded room and spotted him immediately. Matthew was sitting alone in a dimly lit corner booth, facing the main entrance. He was wearing a faded blue baseball cap, pulled low over his eyes, and a plain gray hooded sweatshirt that completely hid his athletic frame. He looked incredibly exhausted, like a man who had been carrying the weight of a massive dark secret for far too long. I walked over and slid into the cracked vinyl booth across from him. We did not hug. We did not even shake hands. The situation was far too dangerous for any normal family greetings. We were two men preparing for a war. Matthew pushed a steaming ceramic mug of coffee across the scratched table toward me, followed by a thick manila envelope. He told me to keep the envelope flat on the table and just look down at the photographs inside. I slid the heavy paper flap open. The first photograph was a grainy surveillance shot of Travis meeting with two men in expensive tactical suits outside a private airstrip. Matthew leaned in close, keeping his voice barely above a whisper. He told me that my polished, smiling son-in-law was not just a greedy corporate accountant stealing from his clients. Travis was a high-level digital cleaner for a ruthless international cyber extortion syndicate. For the past 2 straight years, the Federal Bureau of Investigation had been tracking a massive criminal network. Matthew explained that this syndicate hacked into rural hospitals, municipal power grids, and vulnerable school districts, locking down their critical systems and holding them hostage for millions of dollars in ransom. Travis was the man who washed that blood money. He was the corrupt digital architect who built the complex financial mazes to hide their stolen wealth from the federal government. He took the ransom money, pushed it through dozens of shell companies, and deposited it cleanly into offshore cartel accounts. Matthew took a sip of his black coffee and explained how the trap had been set. His federal unit had finally caught a major break 3 weeks ago. They had successfully frozen a mid-level cartel holding account and squeezed an informant for operational details. Travis immediately felt the walls closing in on him. He knew the federal agents were getting dangerously close to identifying his primary proxy servers. Instead of running away and facing the wrath of his cartel bosses, Travis decided to build a firewall made out of my flesh and blood. Matthew looked me dead in the eye and said, "Travis chose me because I was the absolute perfect target. I was an elderly, grieving widower with significant legitimate retirement assets and a spotless background. Travis had spent the last 6 months aggressively moving his digital operations directly into my home under the charming guise of family bonding. He was planning to hand me over to the authorities as the elusive mastermind. By planting the evidence on my computer and routing the money through my personal internet connection, he was going to close the federal case and allow himself and his cartel bosses to slip away completely unnoticed. I felt a surge of physical sickness in my stomach, but I swallowed it down with a gulp of bitter coffee. I asked Matthew why we could not just drive to his downtown office and arrest him right now. My son shook his head, profound frustration etching deep lines into his forehead. He explained the bitter political reality of federal law enforcement. If they picked up Travis on his way to work this morning, the syndicate leaders would instantly know their cleaner was compromised. They would burn their servers, liquidate their assets, and vanish across international borders within a matter of hours. The Bureau needed Travis to complete his final digital transfer today, so they could trace the massive sum of money directly back to the cartel bosses. Then Matthew dropped the heaviest bombshell of the morning. He told me that Travis had already initiated his ruthless exit strategy. A corrupt local police unit, heavily compensated by the cartel payroll, was scheduled to raid my house at exactly 3 o'clock this afternoon. They were operating on an anonymous tip about illegal firearms and massive digital fraud. They were going to break down my front door, find the planted flash drive behind my bookshelf, tear my entire house apart, and drag me out in handcuffs in front of the entire neighborhood. Travis had arranged for me to be denied bail and thrown into a holding cell where I could not defend myself. Matthew told me he had a heavily armed tactical team standing by at a secure federal safe house just outside the city limits. His immediate plan was to put me in protective custody right now, send agents to pull Rachel out of her office, and let the corrupt local police raid and completely empty house. It was the safest tactical option by far. But it also meant Travis might figure out the trap had been sprung, allowing him to run before the federal net closed around him. I sat back in the vinyl booth and looked at my oldest son. I thought about the 4 agonizing hours I spent freezing in the attic dust last night. I thought about the fake tax document Travis had smiled and handed me this morning, attempting to steal my life savings to buy his own freedom. I thought about the sheer, unforgivable arrogance of a man who believed he could casually dismantle my entire life just to save his own skin. I shook my head slowly. I told Matthew I absolutely refused to be a passive victim, sitting in a sterile room while my home was violated and my daughter's life was destroyed. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the sticky table. I told Matthew I did not just want to survive this ordeal. I wanted to completely destroy the financial foundation Travis had built. I wanted to trap him so deeply in his own lies that he would never see the outside of a maximum security prison cell. I explained that as a structural engineer, I knew exactly how to reverse the load-bearing walls of a building, so it collapsed inward, directly onto the architect. I told my son I knew exactly where Travis kept his physical backup ledger. It was the one piece of damning evidence he kept hidden from both his cartel bosses and his wife. I looked at the glowing digital clock on the diner wall. It was 10 o'clock in the morning. I told Matthew I needed exactly 2 hours inside the house, completely alone. I needed to bypass the biometric safe, flip the digital trap, secure the physical ledger, and drain the cartel accounts before the corrupt raid arrived at my front door. Matthew stared at me for a long time, his rigid federal agent training fiercely fighting against his basic human instinct to protect his father. He saw the absolute unyielding determination in my eyes. He knew I was not asking for permission. He finally nodded his head, slid the classified dossier back into his bag, and told me to get it done. I pulled back into my own driveway at exactly noon. I parked my heavy truck and sat in the cabin for a moment, surveying the property. Travis had already left for his downtown corporate office, and his leased luxury sedan was nowhere in sight. Rachel was also gone. Her silver sport utility vehicle was missing from the garage. I knew she had her yoga class every Friday morning. The house was completely empty. I killed the engine, grabbed my keys, and walked up to the front door. I unlocked it and stepped inside. The silence of the house felt incredibly different now. Just yesterday, it was a peaceful sanctuary. Today, it was an active battlefield. I walked straight down the hallway and pushed open the door to his pristine home office. The room was a monument to his massive ego. Everything was perfectly organized and aggressively modern. He had replaced my antique wooden furniture with sleek glass tables and uncomfortable chrome chairs. The walls were painted a sterile gray. The heavy server rack he had installed last month was humming quietly in the corner, a constant reminder of the digital poison flowing through my home. I bypassed the expensive desktop computer sitting on his glass desk. I knew better than to try and guess his complex passwords or fight through his military-grade encryption. The digital trap was already set, and the corrupt police were coming for that specific machine in 3 hours. I was looking for something far more valuable. I was looking for his ultimate insurance policy. I walked past the desk and went straight to the large closet at the back of the room. Travis was a man obsessed with appearances. His expensive custom suits were hung in perfect color coordination. Dozens of polished leather shoes sat on wooden racks. I dropped to my knees and shoved the bottom row of shoes aside, pulling back the thick carpet. Bolted directly into the concrete foundation of my house was a heavy steel floor safe. It was a high-end model that required a biometric fingerprint scan to open. It had no keyhole and no digital keypad. Staring at the cold steel box, my mind flashed back to a drunken Thanksgiving dinner 3 years ago. It was long before he moved into my house. We were sitting on the back patio smoking cigars and drinking a rare bottle of bourbon. Travis had consumed far too much alcohol that night, and his carefully constructed mask slipped for just a few minutes. He started bragging about his foolproof accounting systems. He laughed at the old men who trusted banks and the young fools who trusted cloud storage. He leaned in close, his breath reeking of expensive liquor, and told me that digital data can always be wiped or seized by the federal government. He proudly declared that a truly smart man never trusts the cloud. A truly smart man always keeps a physical ledger close to his chest, something tangible to bargain with if the walls ever close in. That drunken confession was his fatal mistake. His extreme arrogance was now the key to his absolute undoing. I examined the biometric scanner panel on the top of the safe. It was a small square of thick glass designed to read the unique ridges of a human thumbprint. Travis had opened this safe just a few hours ago to retrieve the cartel cash he packed into his duffel bag. I knew his latent fingerprint was still resting directly on that glass surface. As a structural engineer, I understand how pressure and oils interact with smooth surfaces. I stood up and quickly walked out to my garage workbench. I grabbed a fresh roll of heavy transparent tape and a small flashlight. I hurried back to the office closet and dropped back down to my knees. I turned on the flashlight and angled the beam across the glass scanner. There it was. An oily, perfectly preserved smudge left by his right thumb this morning. My hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline, but I forced myself to take a deep breath. I pulled a small strip of the transparent tape from the roll. I had one single chance to get this right. If I smudged the print or applied the tape at the wrong angle, the biometric data would be ruined, and the safe would permanently lock down. I hovered the sticky side of the tape directly over the glass. I pressed it down with extreme care, making sure not to trap any tiny air bubbles beneath the plastic. I used the soft edge of my own knuckle to smooth the tape over the oily residue, binding his latent fingerprint to the adhesive. I grabbed the edge of the tape and pulled it up in one smooth motion. The glass scanner was now clean, and the invisible oil of his thumbprint was successfully transferred onto the tape in my hand. But the safe required a thermal signature as well as a physical print. A cold piece of plastic would not trick the advanced sensors. I cupped the piece of tape in the palm of my hand and brought it close to my mouth. I breathed hot air directly onto the sticky surface, raising the temperature of the tape to mimic the natural heat of a human body. The adhesive became slightly cloudy with condensation. I immediately placed the tape back down onto the glass scanner, pressing the captured fingerprint exactly where it needed to be. The safe emitted a low electronic hum as the internal laser scanned the surface. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The silence in the closet was deafening. My heart pounded against my ribs. Then the small indicator light on the panel suddenly flashed from angry red to a bright green. The heavy internal locking bolts snapped back with a loud metallic clack. I gripped the steel handle and pulled the heavy door open. The inside of the safe was surprisingly bare. There were no stacks of cash or gold bars. Travis only valued information. Resting on the felt bottom were 2 items. The first was a sleek secondary hard drive. The second was a small leather-bound notebook. I reached in and pulled the notebook out first. I flipped open the thick cover. The pages were completely filled with meticulously handwritten columns. It was a masterpiece of criminal accounting. My eyes scanned the cramped handwriting. It was a complete map of the cartel operations. There were dozens of complex offshore routing numbers, anonymous Cayman Island bank accounts, and the names of international shell companies used to hide the massive ransom payouts. Beside each account number was a corresponding balance running into the tens of millions of dollars. This was the physical ledger he bragged about. This was the absolute proof that Matthew needed to dismantle the entire syndicate. I grabbed the silver hard drive from the safe, knowing it contained the digital backups of his illegal software. I slipped both the hard drive and the leather notebook into the large front pocket of my flannel shirt. I peeled the piece of transparent tape off the glass scanner and shoved it into my jeans. I pushed the heavy steel door shut, letting the bolts lock back into place. I pulled the carpet over the metal plate and arranged his shoes exactly as I had found them. I stood up and walked out of the closet. I had secured the payload. Now I had less than 3 hours to execute the digital heist of a lifetime before the police kicked down my front door. I hurried out of his sterile home office and went straight back into my own study. I avoided my desktop computer completely. That machine was a contaminated crime scene waiting to be discovered by the corrupt police. Instead, I reached into the bottom drawer of my heavy wooden desk and pulled out my personal laptop. It was an older model completely disconnected from the supposedly secure home network he had installed. I placed the laptop on the smooth wood of my desk and pressed the circular power button. The internal cooling fan whirred to life, sounding incredibly loud and erratic in the quiet house. I took the silver hard drive I had just stolen from his biometric safe and plugged the connection cable into the side port of my laptop. A small white indicator light on the drive began to blink rapidly. The computer screen flashed white, and a black security window appeared demanding a complex decryption password. I sat back in my chair and stared at the blinking cursor. Travis was a meticulous digital cleaner who worked for a ruthless international syndicate. He would never use a common dictionary word or a simple family birth date. I needed to bypass military-grade encryption, and I knew I only had a few attempts before the security software permanently locked the drive and wiped all the data. I closed my eyes and thought about the man who married my daughter. I stripped away his fake charm, his tailored suits, and his polished vocabulary. I analyzed his core psychological flaws. His greatest weakness was his massive, unyielding ego. He worshipped his own success. He worshipped financial status. I cast my memory back 5 years back, to the very first day he brought Rachel to my house for a formal dinner. He had just received his first major corporate promotion. He drove up my quiet suburban driveway in a brand new, excessively loud European sports car. He spent 30 minutes standing on my lawn bragging about the engine specifications and the custom leather interior. I remembered walking around the back of that car and staring at his customized vanity license plate. It was a unique combination of his college fraternity letters and the year he made his first $1 million. It was the ultimate arrogant symbol of his narcissism. I opened my eyes and placed my trembling fingers on the plastic keyboard. I slowly typed the exact sequence of letters and numbers from that vanity plate, making sure to capitalize the appropriate characters. I took a deep breath and pressed the enter key. The computer froze for a terrifying second. The cooling fan seemed to stop spinning. Then the black security window vanished completely. The silver drive was unlocked. My screen was instantly flooded with thousands of highly organized files. I clicked on the master directory folder. My breath caught in my throat as the screen populated with hundreds of scanned passports, fake corporate identities, and detailed wire transfer receipts. I opened a subfolder labeled with the specific name of the syndicate Matthew had mentioned. It contained direct encrypted communications between Travis and the cartel bosses. I scrolled through the text messages, reading his cold, calculated updates about cleaning their ransom money. He was entirely responsible for laundering the funds stolen from the regional hospitals and the municipal power grids. The sheer volume of the digital evidence was absolutely staggering. It was the absolute proof that would send him to a federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. I had the weapon I needed to destroy his entire empire. Suddenly, the heavy wooden front door downstairs unlocked with a loud metallic click. The sound echoed up the main staircase like a gunshot. My heart slammed violently against my ribs. I looked at the digital clock displayed in the corner of my laptop screen. It was barely 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Rachel was not supposed to be home for another 2 hours. She always went to a long lunch with her friends after her Friday morning yoga class. I heard her drop her heavy keychain onto the glass entryway table I heard her call out my name from the bottom of the stairs. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded my veins. If she walked into my private study and saw me holding his secure drive, she would ask questions I could not answer. If she innocently mentioned it to him later tonight, he would realize his operation was compromised. He would eliminate both of us before the sun went down. I did not hesitate for a single second. I reached out and violently yanked the connection cable directly out of the laptop port, completely bypassing all the safe ejection protocols. The computer screen flickered wildly and threw a massive error message. I slammed the laptop shut and shoved it deep into the bottom drawer of my desk, kicking the drawer closed with my foot. I grabbed the silver hard drive and the physical leather notebook I had taken from the safe. I frantically shoved both of them into the large inner pocket of my heavy flannel shirt. I stood up so fast, my leather office chair rolled backward and slammed loudly into the bookshelf behind me. I took a deep, shaky breath, forcing my racing heart rate to slow down. I smoothed the wrinkles out of my shirt, making sure the square outline of the physical ledger was completely hidden beneath the thick fabric. I stepped out of my study and pulled the heavy door shut behind me, concealing the infected desktop computer from view. I walked down the carpeted hallway and met my daughter at the top of the stairs. She was wearing her dark athletic clothes and carrying a rolled-up purple foam mat under her arm. She looked incredibly annoyed. I forced a warm, gentle smile onto my face, projecting the image of a happy father. I asked her why she was home so early, pretending to be pleasantly surprised by her sudden appearance. She sighed heavily and started complaining about the terrible city traffic. She explained that a major water main had burst downtown, flooding the main intersection near her yoga studio and completely ruining her lunch plans. She dropped her exercise mat on the wooden floor and rubbed her temples, saying she just wanted to take a long, hot bath and relax in her bedroom. I could not let her go upstairs to her room. If she went into her bedroom closet, she might notice that I had disturbed his perfectly organized rows of shoes. I needed to keep her moving. I needed to keep her completely distracted. I reached out and gently squeezed her shoulder. I told her I was incredibly sorry her day was ruined, but her arriving early was actually a massive blessing in disguise. I lied smoothly, telling her I had just been out in the garage trying to organize the heavy wooden boxes filled with my late wife's winter decorations. I told her my lower back was acting up again, and I desperately needed her help to carry the heaviest boxes down from the high shelves before I drove out to the hardware store. Rachel looked at me with a tired expression, but she immediately nodded her head. She was a good daughter. She never refused to help me when I asked. She turned around and walked back down the stairs, leading the way toward the kitchen and the side door that opened into the garage. I followed close behind her, my right hand resting casually over the heavy pocket of my flannel shirt. Every step felt like walking through deep, freezing water. I had successfully steered her away from his office. I had successfully secured the most damning evidence of his entire criminal career. The physical ledger and the digital drive were pressing heavily against my chest. But the victory felt incredibly hollow as I looked at the round clock hanging on the kitchen wall. It was exactly 1:30 in the afternoon. The corrupt local police raid was scheduled for 3 o'clock sharp. I had exactly 90 minutes to initiate the massive financial transfer drain, the cartel accounts, and set the final trap. I had the evidence, but the hardest part of the operation was still ahead of me. I had to manage my unsuspecting daughter execute a multi-million-dollar wire fraud against a ruthless criminal syndicate and prepare my peaceful home for a violent police invasion. The ticking clock was deafening in my ears. I opened the heavy fireproof door to the garage and followed my daughter into the cold, concrete room. The concrete floor of the garage was freezing beneath my boots. The air smelled of motor oil and old cardboard. I guided my daughter toward the towering metal storage shelves that lined the back wall. I pointed to the heavy plastic bins containing my late wife's winter decorations, apologizing again for pulling her away from her relaxing afternoon. Rachel sighed, tied her hair back into a messy knot, and reached up to grab the first heavy container. As soon as her back was completely turned, I stepped behind the massive frame of my heavy-duty workbench. I pulled my smartphone from my jeans pocket. My hands were sweating so profusely, I almost dropped the device onto the hard concrete. I had the physical leather ledger tucked securely inside my flannel shirt. I carefully pulled it out, keeping it entirely out of Rachel's line of sight. I opened the small notebook to the center pages where Travis had meticulously documented the cartel's primary holding accounts. I unlocked my phone and opened my personal banking application. Because Travis had spent the last 6 months weaving my legitimate retirement funds into his massive web of money laundering, my own digital fingerprint was now authorized to access their offshore reserves. He had given me the keys to the cartel vault without even realizing it. He thought I was just a blind, obedient proxy. I was about to show him the true cost of underestimating an old man. I navigated through the complex security menus of the banking application. The interface was bright and clinical, a stark contrast to the dark, violent reality of the money I was about to move. I looked at the handwritten Cayman Island routing numbers in the leather notebook. I used my thumb to type the long string of digits into my phone. I had to be absolutely precise. A single incorrect number would trigger an automated fraud alert and freeze the entire operation. I verified the account information twice. The screen loaded a new page displaying the current available balance in the cartel holding account. The number staring back at me was absolutely staggering. It was exactly $14 million. It was blood money extorted from vulnerable hospitals and municipal power grids. It was the financial lifeblood of a ruthless international syndicate. Matthew had given me a highly classified federal routing number during our brief meeting at the diner. It was a direct pipeline to an impenetrable Federal Bureau of Investigation frozen asset fund. I typed Matthew's routing number into the destination field. The banking application asked me to confirm the transfer amount. I did not hesitate. I typed $14 million, draining the holding account down to absolutely zero. I stared at the bright green submit button on the screen. Pressing that button was the absolute point of no return. Once the money crossed into the federal grid, it was permanently gone. The cartel would immediately realize they had been robbed. I took a deep breath, looked over at my daughter, who was busy stacking boxes near my truck, and pressed my thumb firmly against the screen. The application paused for 2 agonizing seconds, a small circle spinning in the center of the display. Then a bold confirmation message appeared. The transfer was completely successful. The money was gone. But simply stealing the money was not enough. If the cartel thought I had stolen the funds, they would hunt down my daughter and me for the rest of our lives. I needed to aim their terrifying wrath directly at the man who actually deserved it. I needed to completely dismantle the protective shield Travis had built around himself. I opened my encrypted email application. Using the contact information I had just memorized from the decrypted digital drive upstairs, I drafted a new message to the primary cartel liaison. I did not write a long, elaborate explanation. Criminals do not respect words, they respect actions. I attached a digital screenshot of the finalized wire transfer receipt. In the main body of the email, I typed a single devastating sentence. Travis stole your money. I did not send the email immediately. I used the application settings to schedule the delivery for exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon. 3 o'clock was the exact moment Travis had arranged for the corrupt local police to kick down my front door and arrest me. It was the exact moment he planned to walk into his corporate office, call his cartel bosses, and tell them his brilliant firewall had worked perfectly. I wanted that email to hit their encrypted servers at the very second he tried to claim his victory. I wanted him to realize that he was completely cut off, completely exposed, and actively hunted by the most dangerous men on the planet. I was not just framing him for a financial crime. I was stripping away his powerful allies and throwing him directly to the wolves. I locked my phone and slid it back into my pocket. I tucked the leather notebook back inside my heavy flannel shirt. The immense weight of what I had just accomplished settled over me. I had successfully executed a massive cyber heist from the dusty corner of my own suburban garage. I walked out from behind the workbench, ready to help Rachel carry the rest of the boxes inside. I felt a strange, cold sense of calm washing over my exhausted body. The trap was perfectly set. All I had to do now was wait for the clock to strike 3. Rachel wiped a streak of dirt from her forehead and smiled at me. She asked if I wanted to load the boxes into the back of my truck now, or wait until after I returned from the hardware store. Before I could answer her question, a harsh, violent sound ripped through the quiet suburban air. It was the distinct, heavy crunch of thick rubber tires aggressively tearing up the loose gravel at the end of my long driveway. I froze completely. The sound was wrong. My quiet neighborhood was strictly paved asphalt. The only loose gravel was the decorative border lining the entrance to my property. I turned my head and looked through the small, dusty window built into the heavy garage door. My heart violently dropped into my stomach. 4 large, unmarked black sport utility vehicles had just swerved off the main road. They did not park neatly on the street. They aggressively jumped the curb, crushing my late wife's carefully manicured flower beds, and skidded to a chaotic halt directly in front of my house. They formed a tight, impenetrable blockade across my driveway. These were not normal police cruisers. There were no flashing red and blue lights. There were no official city seals painted on the doors. They were the aggressive, unmarked vehicles used by specialized tactical units. The doors of the heavy vehicles swung open simultaneously. Men dressed in dark, unbranded tactical gear began pouring out onto my front lawn. They were carrying heavy breaching equipment and military-grade rifles. A cold wave of absolute terror washed over me. I looked up at the round clock hanging above my workbench. It was only 1:45 in the afternoon. The corrupt police raid was not supposed to happen for another hour and 15 minutes. Travis had lied to his cartel contacts. He had accelerated the timeline. He had sent his paid mercenaries to raid my house early, knowing I would be caught completely off guard. Rachel walked up behind me and tried to look out the window. She asked me who those men were and why they were parking on our lawn. I spun around and grabbed her by the shoulders, pushing her away from the glass. I could not let her be seen. I could not let these corrupt armed men know that my innocent daughter was trapped inside the house with me. The carefully calculated plan I had spent all morning building was suddenly crumbling around me. I had the evidence and I had drained the money, but none of that mattered if these cartel mercenaries put a bullet in my chest before I could hand the proof over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The war had just arrived at my front door, and it was an hour early. The heavy pounding on the front door echoed like cannon fire all the way into the garage. Rachel was completely frozen, staring out the small glass window at the armed men swarming our front lawn. I used her paralyzing shock to my absolute advantage. I turned my back to her and moved rapidly down the length of my wooden workbench. I grabbed an empty, rusted paint can sitting near the edge. I yanked the metal lid off with a flathead screwdriver. I took the silver hard drive and the leather-bound ledger from my flannel shirt and dropped them directly into the empty can. I grabbed a heavy rubber mallet and hammered the metal lid back into place, sealing the evidence completely tight. I took the can and tossed it carelessly into a messy pile of old painting supplies and dirty drop cloths in the far corner of the garage. It landed with a dull thud, perfectly camouflaged among the garbage. The pounding at the front door intensified. It sounded like they were using the heavy steel butt of a tactical rifle against the solid wood. I grabbed Rachel by the arm and pulled her away from the garage window. I told her to stay exactly where she was and not to say a single word. I walked out of the garage, down the short hallway, and stepped into the main foyer. The heavy wooden door was shaking violently in its frame. I took a deep breath, unlocking the deadbolt and turning the brass handle. I did not even get the chance to pull the door open myself. 3 heavily armed detectives shoved the heavy door inward with massive, violent force. The wood crashed loudly against the interior drywall, leaving a deep, permanent dent. They pushed past me, their heavy black boots loudly tracking mud and dirt across my pristine hardwood floors. They were not wearing standard police uniforms. They wore dark tactical vests over plain clothes. They did not look like public servants sworn to protect the community. They looked exactly like the paid cartel mercenaries they truly were. The lead detective was a tall, heavily muscled man with cold, dead eyes. He shoved a crumpled piece of paper directly into my chest. He barked my full name and told me they had a signed warrant to search the entire premises for illegal digital equipment and unregistered firearms. He did not read me my rights. He did not offer any explanation. He pointed a thick, gloved finger directly at my face and ordered me to sit down in the living room and keep my hands perfectly visible. He then turned his head and signaled the other 2 men. He ordered them to secure the perimeter and told them he was heading straight for the back study. I watched the lead detective take his first heavy step toward the hallway leading to my private office. He knew exactly where he was going. Travis had given him the exact coordinates of the planted flash drive hidden behind the oak bookshelf. If that corrupt detective walked into my study right now, he would miraculously find the digital evidence slap cold steel handcuffs on my wrists and drag me out of my house before I could even defend myself. Once I was in their custody, I would disappear into a holding cell and likely suffer a fatal, unrecorded accident before morning. I needed to stop his forward momentum instantly. I needed to introduce a massive, chaotic variable into their carefully controlled operation. I needed legitimate outside witnesses. I stood in the center of the foyer and triggered a catastrophic failure of my own biological systems. I did not just fall down. I executed a precise, terrifying performance. I suddenly gasped incredibly loudly, sucking in a massive breath of air as if all the oxygen had just been sucked out of the room. I brought my right hand up and violently clutched the center of my chest, twisting the fabric of my flannel shirt into a tight knot. I locked my knees and let my eyes roll back slightly into my head. I let out a sharp, agonizing groan that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. The lead detective stopped dead in his tracks and spun around. I did not give him time to process what he was seeing. I let my entire body weight collapse toward the right side. I crashed heavily into the tall wooden display table standing in the hallway. My shoulder slammed into the polished wood, completely shattering a massive, heavy glass vase my late wife had bought in Italy. The thick glass exploded across the hardwood floor with a deafening crash, sending sharp shards flying in every direction. I hit the ground hard intentionally, allowing my head to bounce slightly against the floorboards to sell the violent impact. I lay on my back among the broken glass, my limbs twitching erratically. I took short, ragged breaths, making a wet, rattling sound deep in my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut and contorted my face into a mask of pure, unbearable agony. Rachel ran out from the garage hallway just as I hit the ground. She saw me lying in the shattered glass, clutching my chest and gasping for air. She let out a piercing, blood-curdling scream of sheer terror. She did not see a calculated tactical maneuver. She saw her elderly father suffering a massive, fatal heart attack right in front of her eyes. She threw herself onto the floor next to me, completely ignoring the armed men standing in the room. She grabbed my face, screaming my name over and over again, tears immediately streaming down her cheeks. She pulled her cell phone from her pocket, with shaking hands, and instantly dialed 911. She screamed at the emergency dispatcher that her father was dying and demanded an ambulance immediately. I kept my eyes squeezed shut, but I could hear the absolute panic suddenly radiating from the three corrupt detectives. This was not part of their script. Travis had paid them to execute a quiet, intimidating arrest of a compliant old man. They were supposed to walk in, find the planted drive, and drag me out to their unmarked vehicles without drawing any neighborhood attention. They desperately needed a sterile, controlled environment to pull off this frame job. Now they had a catastrophic medical emergency unfolding in the middle of the foyer. They had a hysterical daughter screaming at the top of her lungs. And worst of all, they had an official recorded emergency dispatch call that would bring legitimate city paramedics and fire department personnel swarming to the address within minutes. The lead detective cursed loudly, his voice cracking with sudden stress. I heard him pacing rapidly back and forth across the glass-covered floor. He yelled at his men to fall back to the living room immediately. He knew he could not walk into my study and miraculously find the evidence while I was dying on the floor. If I died right here in the hallway during a raid, there would be a massive, unavoidable state investigation. Every single action they took would be heavily scrutinized by internal affairs and the medical examiner. They were completely paralyzed. By forcing a massive system failure, I had successfully broken their entire timeline. I lay on the cold, hardwood floor, listening to the wailing sirens of the approaching ambulance growing louder in the distance, and knew my decoy play had worked perfectly. The paramedics arrived in less than 5 minutes. The wailing sound of their approaching sirens was the most beautiful noise I had ever heard. I felt the heavy canvas straps of the medical stretcher locked tightly right across my chest. Rachel was crying hysterically, gripping my hand so hard her fingernails dug painfully into my skin as they quickly loaded me into the back of the brightly lit ambulance. As the heavy rear doors slammed shut, sealing us inside, I caught a brief, highly satisfying glimpse of the lead detective standing on my front porch. He looked absolutely furious, barking frantically into his shoulder-mounted radio. His unmarked tactical vehicles were completely blocked in by the massive flashing fire engine and the local emergency medical transport. By staging a catastrophic medical emergency in the main foyer, I had turned my private residence into a highly public, active rescue scene. Dozens of legitimate city firefighters and emergency medical technicians were now swarming the property, logging their official presence and securing the perimeter for my safety. The corrupt tactical unit was entirely paralyzed. They could not risk walking into my private study and miraculously discovering a planted cartel flash drive while surrounded by legitimate first responders. If they contaminated a potential medical death scene state, investigators would tear their entire precinct apart, looking for procedural violations. They were forced to retreat empty-handed, leaving the planted digital evidence safely untouched behind my heavy oak bookshelf. My desperate decoy play had worked flawlessly. The ambulance ride was a chaotic blur of blaring sirens and sharp, aggressive turns. The paramedics rushed me through the sliding glass doors of the emergency room, shouting medical codes to the waiting trauma team. Nurses immediately surrounded my bed, cutting open my heavy flannel shirt with trauma shears. They attached cold, sticky electrical pads directly to my chest and hooked me up to a massive electrocardiogram machine. They were fully expecting to see the chaotic, erratic electrical signals of a dying heart. Instead, the glowing monitor displayed a perfectly steady, rhythmic pulse. The attending emergency physician frowned deeply, looking back and forth between the completely healthy digital reading and my supposed severe symptoms. I knew I had to buy more time and keep the medical staff convinced I was in critical danger. I groaned softly, clutching my left shoulder, and complaining of severe crushing chest pressure and extreme physical exhaustion. I played the role of a terrified, dying old man perfectly. The doctor immediately ordered a mild intravenous sedative and completely restricted my visitors, instructing a weeping Rachel to wait out in the main hallway until they ran a comprehensive panel of cardiac blood tests. I lay entirely alone in the sterile hospital room, staring up at the bright white acoustic ceiling tiles. The room smelled strongly of harsh chemical antiseptic and clean linens. I turned my head slightly to look at the digital clock mounted on the far wall. The glowing red numbers read 2:15 in the afternoon. I had exactly 45 minutes left until the automated email I had scheduled in the garage would finally send. 45 minutes until the ruthless cartel bosses received the undeniable proof that Travis had drained their $14 million holding account. The tension in my chest was no longer an act. It was a cold, heavy knot of pure anticipation. Exactly an hour after I was admitted to the emergency room, the heavy wooden door to my private hospital suite violently swung open. Travis stormed inside. He did not look anything like the polished, confident corporate accountant who had calmly handed me a fake tax document at the kitchen island this morning. His carefully constructed mask of perfection was completely shattered. His expensive silk tie was violently loosened and pulled askew. His tailored charcoal suit jacket was wrinkled and stained with sweat. His face was flushed red with raw, unadulterated panic. He had clearly just received word from his paid mercenaries that their heavily orchestrated raid had failed spectacularly. He knew his perfect firewall was crumbling. He knew he was rapidly running out of time to deliver me to the cartel as the criminal mastermind. He marched directly past the foot of my hospital bed and aggressively confronted the attending nurse, who was quietly checking my intravenous fluid line. Travis aggressively shoved a heavy plastic clipboard directly into her chest, forcing her to step backward in shock. He raised his voice, his tone dripping with arrogant entitlement and desperate authority. He loudly declared that he was my son-in-law and that he held my full, legally binding medical power of attorney. He ordered the nurse to unhook my heart monitors and remove my intravenous lines immediately. He stated in a commanding voice that the local hospital facilities were completely inadequate and that he was transferring me to a private specialized cardiac clinic across town for an emergency surgical procedure. The young nurse looked terrified by his sudden aggressive behavior, but she stood her ground. She tried to calmly explain that moving a critical cardiac patient against direct medical advice was highly dangerous and against hospital protocol. Travis viciously cut her off, shouting that he was assuming all legal and financial liability. He pointed a trembling, furious finger directly at the paper clipped to the board. It was the exact same tax extension document he had given me at breakfast, the one with the hidden irrevocable power of attorney clause buried on the second page. I knew exactly what his supposed private cardiac clinic really was. It was absolutely not a legitimate medical facility. It was a cartel-controlled butcher shop. If he successfully bullied this nurse into releasing me, his mercenaries would load me into the back of a private transport van, and I would never see the sun again. A corrupt, paid-off doctor would simply administer a lethal dose of potassium directly into my veins to simulate a massive, fatal heart attack. They would permanently silence the only man who could expose his massive money laundering operation, and they would do it under the absolute legal protection of my own forged signature. He was trying to execute me legally right in the middle of a crowded city hospital. I lay perfectly still on the stiff hospital mattress. I did not tense my muscles. I did not allow my breathing to become shallow or erratic. I listened to the steady, rhythmic beeping of my heart monitor, echoing through the tense room. The machine proved I was completely calm. My pulse did not elevate a single beat. I had anticipated this exact desperate move since the moment I signed that document with my left hand. I slowly opened my eyes. The bright fluorescent lights of the hospital room stung my vision for a second, but I quickly focused my gaze. I turned my head on the thin white pillow and looked directly at his panicked, sweating face. Travis stopped yelling at the nurse and stared down at me. For a split second, he looked relieved that I was conscious, thinking I would simply obey his commands like I always did. He expected me to be the weak, compliant old man he had manipulated for the past 6 months. I did not raise my voice. I did not shout or show any trace of fear. I kept my tone incredibly low, cold, and absolutely steady. I let the authority of a man who had spent 40 years building unbreakable structures resonate in every single syllable. I told him he did not have authorization for anything. I kept my eyes locked on Travis. The sheer shock of hearing my steady, authoritative voice temporarily short-circuited his brain. He had stormed into this hospital room expecting to find a broken, heavily sedated victim. He expected absolute compliance from a man he viewed as obsolete and weak. Instead, he found a man completely in control of his own faculties, staring back at him with cold, calculating precision. For a few agonizing seconds, the only sound in the sterile suite was the rhythmic, steady beep of my heart monitor. The machine broadcasted my absolute calm to the entire room. Then his initial shock rapidly morphed into a desperate, ugly rage. He took a threatening, aggressive step toward the side of my bed, raising his voice to a booming volume, demanding to know what I was talking about. He told me to stop acting crazy and let the private medical transport team do their job. He aggressively waved the heavy plastic clipboard in the air, clinging to that forged document, like a drowning man clinging to a life preserver. Before he could take another threatening step toward me, the heavy wooden door of the adjoining private bathroom swung open. The sharp, authoritative click of high heels against the polished linoleum floor echoed loudly through the room. My attorney, Rebecca, stepped out into the harsh fluorescent light. She was dressed in a pristine, tailored navy blue suit, carrying a thick, expensive leather briefcase. She radiated a level of professional intimidation that instantly sucked the oxygen right out of Travis's lungs. He stopped dead in his tracks, his mouth hanging slightly open, staring at her in complete disbelief. He had absolutely no idea who she was, or why a high-powered corporate lawyer was hiding inside a hospital bathroom, waiting for him to arrive. Rebecca completely ignored his threatening physical posture. She walked straight past him, with the effortless grace of a predator who knows exactly where she stands in the food chain. She approached the young attending nurse who was still clutching the footboard of my bed, completely bewildered by the sudden escalation. Rebecca reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of crisp official documents sealed in a blue folder. She handed the top packet directly to the nurse. It was a freshly stamped, highly expedited federal injunction signed by a district judge just an hour ago. Rebecca spoke with a cold, piercing clarity that demanded absolute silence and attention. She informed the medical staff that I had completely revoked all prior legal, medical, and financial authorizations early this morning. She systematically explained that any documentation claiming to grant medical power of attorney to my son-in-law was to be considered highly fraudulent and part of an active federal investigation. She stated firmly that the specific document Travis was desperately waving around was entirely null and void, and that I was under the strict protective watch of her legal firm. Travis let out a harsh, barking laugh that sounded much more like a panic attack than genuine amusement. He pointed a trembling finger at Rebecca, his voice cracking violently under the immense pressure. He loudly claimed that he had just watched me sign the medical release with his own 2 eyes at my kitchen island just a few short hours ago. He insisted the paperwork was completely legally binding, notarized, and that she was illegally interfering with a critical life-saving medical procedure. He puffed out his chest, trying to use his corporate intimidation tactics on a woman who destroyed corrupt executives for a living. Rebecca slowly turned around to face him. She did not flinch. She looked at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. She reached out and smoothly pulled the heavy plastic clipboard right out of his sweating hands. She did not even bother to read the dense legal jargon he had carefully drafted. She flipped the pages directly to the signature line at the very bottom of the second sheet. She tapped her perfectly manicured fingernail against the blue ink. She coldly explained that any competent legal notary or even a basic forensic handwriting expert would instantly recognize the massive glaring discrepancy. She looked him dead in the eye and stated that my documented legal signature on file with my trust is a fluid, confident, right-handed script. She pointed at the paper and noted that the jagged, messy, asymmetrical loops on his document were clearly executed with a non-dominant left hand. She told him it was the sloppiest forgery attempt she had seen in her entire legal career. I watched Travis stare down at the fake signature he had rushed me to sign at breakfast. I watched the exact moment his arrogant, perfectly constructed reality violently shattered into a million irreparable pieces. His eyes darted frantically across the jagged blue ink. The memory clearly flashed across his face. He remembered leaning over the granite counter holding his coffee. He remembered telling me to hurry up because his courier was waiting outside. He realized he had been so completely blinded by his own greed and his own massive ego that he never even bothered to check which hand I used to hold the gold pen. His face lost absolutely all of its color. His skin turned a sickly pale shade of gray. The polished, untouchable corporate accountant was completely gone. In his place stood a terrified, desperate criminal who suddenly realized he had walked blindly into a devastating, inescapable trap. The corrupt local police raid had failed entirely. The medical kidnapping had failed spectacularly. His entire legal safety net was completely incinerated in front of his eyes. He was standing in a highly public, heavily monitored city hospital room. He was surrounded by legitimate medical professionals and a ruthless federal attorney. He could not use physical violence here. He could not force me out of the building. He was completely trapped in a sterile cage. I lay on the hospital bed, watching his chest heave rapidly as he struggled to pull oxygen into his panicked lungs. I wanted him to feel the exact same suffocating helplessness I felt when I was hiding in the dark, dusty attic last night. I wanted him to understand that a strong building does not collapse by accident. It collapses because the foundation was systematically and intentionally compromised by a superior architect. The heavy, suffocating silence in the room was suddenly shattered by a harsh, aggressive buzzing sound. It was coming from the inner pocket of his wrinkled suit jacket. Travis jumped violently, his hand flying to his chest, as if he had just been physically struck. He reached inside his coat and pulled out his encrypted cartel burner phone. I turned my head slightly against the pillow and looked at the digital clock mounted on the white hospital wall. The bright red numbers read exactly 3:05 in the afternoon. The automated email I had carefully scheduled from my garage had just hit the cartel servers. The message containing the final wire transfer receipt and the devastating declaration of his personal betrayal had been successfully delivered. Travis looked down at the glowing screen of his secure phone. I could not see the text messages flooding his device from my position on the bed, but I absolutely did not need to. I watched his physical reaction. The remaining blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a walking corpse. His eyes widened in absolute pure terror. His jaw dropped slightly, his mouth opening and closing rapidly without producing a single coherent sound. The small electronic device in his hand was no longer a tool of communication. It was a digital death warrant. The ruthless criminal syndicate he worked for now firmly believed he had stolen $14 million of their extorted ransom money. They believed he had framed me to cover his own tracks and fund his escape. They did not care about local police raids, forged signatures, or failed medical transfers. They only cared that their massive fortune was permanently gone, and his name was directly attached to the brazen theft. His hands began to shake so violently that he almost dropped the phone onto the hard linoleum floor. He looked up from the glowing screen and stared directly into my eyes. He finally understood the full, terrifying scope of what I had done to him. He realized I had not just blocked his legal authority to seize my house and my pension. I had actively dismantled his entire criminal operation from the inside out. I had taken his illicit money, destroyed his professional reputation, and painted a massive glowing target squarely on his back. He was no longer the apex predator stalking a weak, oblivious old man. He was the prey. He was a dead man walking surrounded by powerful enemies on all sides, with absolutely nowhere left to run and nowhere left to hide. Travis backed away from the foot of my hospital bed. His expensive leather shoes squeaked awkwardly against the polished linoleum floor. He bumped his shoulder heavily into the wooden doorframe, nearly losing his balance as he stumbled backward. He did not say another word. He did not try to argue with my attorney or threaten me again. The absolute reality of his situation had finally crushed the breath right out of his lungs. He turned around and bolted down the brightly lit corridor. I listened to his frantic footsteps echoing down the hallway, getting faster and faster until they completely disappeared. He was running for his life. As soon as the sound of his footsteps faded away, Rebecca calmly closed the heavy door to my private suite. She offered me a brief professional nod and stepped quietly into the corner of the room. The door opened again a few seconds later. Matthew walked inside. He was no longer wearing the faded civilian disguise from the diner. He had his official black tactical vest strapped tightly across his chest, his federal badge prominently displayed. He was holding a secure digital tablet in his right hand. He walked over to the side of my bed and looked down at me. A tight, grim smile touched the corners of his mouth. Matthew tapped the glass screen of his tablet and turned it toward me. It displayed a live scrolling transcription of an intercepted, encrypted phone call. Matthew kept his voice low and incredibly steady. He told me that my automated email had detonated like a massive bomb inside the cartel headquarters. The syndicate bosses had immediately verified their offshore accounts and discovered that their entire $14 million holding fund was completely drained. Because the massive sum of money was funneled directly into an impenetrable federal holding grid, they instantly knew it was not a simple banking error. They read my short, devastating message. They looked at the attached wire receipt. Matthew confirmed that the cartel leaders did not hesitate for a single second. They had just issued a massive open bounty on my son-in-law. Matthew explained exactly what that meant in the criminal underworld. The men Travis worked for did not involve lawyers or local police when they were robbed. They dispatched professional hunters. Every paid mercenary, every corrupt local officer, and every cartel enforcer in the city had just received his photograph and his personal vehicle details directly to their encrypted phones. They were instructed to bring him in alive so the cartel could painfully extract the exact location of their missing millions before executing him. The financial chokehold I had designed in my garage was now pulled incredibly tight around his neck. Travis was completely cut off from every possible resource. He could not access my retirement funds to buy a private flight out of the country. His own legitimate corporate bank accounts were already being frozen by Matthew's federal cyber unit. He had no cash in his pockets. He had no powerful allies left to protect him. His perfect, arrogant life had been systematically dismantled in less than 3 hours. I had heard enough. The decoy phase of my plan was officially over. I reached over with my right hand and grabbed the thick medical tape securing the intravenous fluid line to the back of my left hand. I ripped the adhesive off in one quick, aggressive motion. I pulled the sharp steel needle directly out of my vein. A small drop of dark blood welled up on my skin, but I completely ignored it. I tossed the clear plastic tubing onto the sterile mattress. The heart monitor immediately began to beep rapidly as the sensitive sensors detected my sudden movement. I reached up and aggressively tore the sticky electrical pads right off my chest, silencing the annoying machine completely. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and planted my bare feet firmly on the cold hospital floor. Matthew put his digital tablet down on the tray table and tried to tell me to stay in the bed. He reminded me that the hospital staff still thought I was a critical cardiac patient, recovering from a massive heart attack. I looked my oldest son squarely in the eyes and told him there was absolutely no time left for playing sick. I grabbed my flannel shirt from the chair next to the bed. It had been cut open down the middle by the emergency paramedics, but I threw it over my shoulders anyway. I stepped into my heavy work boots and left the laces untied. I grabbed Matthew by the thick canvas strap of his tactical vest. I told him he needed to secure his sister immediately. I explained that Travis was no longer a calculating corporate accountant, trying to execute a clever financial frame job. His pristine logic was completely gone. He was now a hunted animal. I used the cold, hard logic of structural engineering to explain his next move. When you apply massive crushing pressure to an unstable element, it will always follow the path of least resistance. Travis had just realized his digital empire was entirely gone. His cartel protection had instantly transformed into a death sentence. His access to my wealth was permanently blocked by a federal judge. He had absolutely nothing left to bargain with, except the one thing he believed was still safely hidden inside my house. He needed the physical leather ledger. He desperately needed the handwritten offshore routing numbers and the secondary hard drive locked inside his biometric floor safe. He believed he could use those highly sensitive documents to negotiate his life with the Federal Bureau of Investigation or trade them to a rival criminal syndicate for safe passage across the southern border. He did not know I had already cracked his safe. He did not know the evidence he needed to survive was currently sitting inside a rusted paint can in the corner of my garage. I told Matthew that Travis was driving his luxury sedan back to my house right now. He was heading straight into the suburbs to rip his pristine home office apart. But Rachel was still there. She had watched the paramedics carry me away earlier this afternoon. She was entirely alone in that big empty house, waiting anxiously by the telephone for an update on my medical condition. If Travis walked through that front door and found her standing between him and his last remaining lifeline, he would not hesitate to use physical violence. He would take her as a hostage to guarantee his escape. A man who is actively hunted by a ruthless cartel does not care about his sacred wedding vows. He does not care about the woman he claimed to love. He only cares about his own raw survival. I tightened my grip on Matthew's heavy vest. I told him to call his tactical team and lock down every single street leading into my neighborhood. I told him we were leaving this hospital right now, walking out through the back exit and driving straight to my property. Matthew saw the absolute terrifying urgency radiating from my face. He understood that the situation had just escalated into a highly volatile hostage scenario. He nodded his head once in agreement. He raised his radio microphone to his shoulder and began barking rapid, aggressive orders to his federal agents. We walked out of the hospital suite together, completely ignoring the loud protests of the attending nurse who had just rushed back into the room. We left the broken pieces of his legal strategy scattered on the floor and headed straight toward the hospital parking garage. The trap was perfectly reversed, but the war was not entirely over until the architect of this nightmare was permanently locked inside a federal cage. I climbed into the passenger seat of Matthew's armored vehicle. We sped out onto the busy city streets, racing against the clock to intercept a cornered rat before he could destroy the only family I had left. The ride in Matthew's armored tactical vehicle was suffocatingly tense. The heavy engine roared as we tore through the city streets, weaving violently through the late afternoon traffic. I watched the familiar suburban landscape blur past my passenger window. Usually this drive felt peaceful, a gentle transition from the loud city to the quiet sanctuary of my neighborhood. Now it felt like a countdown to an inevitable explosion. Behind us, 3 unmarked black sport utility vehicles followed in a tight, aggressive formation, carrying Matthew's elite federal tactical team. Matthew gripped the leather steering wheel, his knuckles completely white, his eyes constantly scanning the road ahead. He was coordinating with the regional dispatcher through his secure earpiece, ensuring the corrupt local police were completely locked out of our operational grid. We were going in entirely alone, trusting only the federal agents in our convoy. The closer we got to my house, the heavier the dread settled in my chest. I knew exactly what a desperate man was capable of, and my innocent daughter was still trapped inside that house with him. We turned onto my quiet, tree-lined street. The manicured lawns and automatic sprinkler systems looked absurdly normal in the fading sunlight. But as we pulled up to the curb, the illusion of suburban safety vanished instantly. My heavy, solid wood front door was not just unlocked. It was completely smashed inward, hanging precariously off its shattered iron hinges. Splinters of polished wood and twisted metal strike plates were scattered across the concrete porch. Travis had not bothered to use his house key. He had kicked the door off its frame in a state of absolute blind panic. Matthew killed the engine and immediately drew his federal-issue sidearm from his hip holster. He signaled for the tactical team to deploy. Heavily armed men silently poured out of the trailing vehicles, moving with terrifying practiced precision to surround the perimeter of my property. Matthew looked at me and silently gestured for me to stay inside the armored vehicle. I completely ignored his command. I unbuckled my seatbelt and stepped out onto the asphalt. That was my house and that was my daughter inside. I walked up the driveway, my heavy work boots making absolutely no sound. I stepped through the ruined doorway, the crunch of broken wood under my feet, echoing loudly in the main foyer. The house felt entirely different now. It felt violently violated. From down the long hallway, the sickening sounds of pure destruction vibrated through the floorboards. It was the sound of heavy furniture being systematically smashed against drywall, the sound of tearing paper, and the frantic, animalistic grunting of a man completely losing his mind. Matthew moved ahead of me, his weapon raised meticulously, clearing the corners of the living room and the kitchen. I did not need to clear any rooms. I knew exactly where the noise was coming from. I walked straight toward the back of the house, toward his pristine home office. The door to the office was wide open. The room I had seen in perfect sterile condition just a few hours ago was completely unrecognizable. Travis was tearing the space apart like a wild, cornered beast. The expensive glass desk was shattered into thousands of jagged pieces across the carpet. My antique wooden bookshelves were forcefully pulled down, heavy volumes ripped in half their pages, scattered everywhere like freshly fallen snow. The drywall was punched through in half a dozen places, exposing the raw wooden studs and pink fiberglass insulation underneath. He was searching frantically for hidden compartments, tearing the room down to its very skeleton. In the center of the deep closet, the thick gray carpet was ripped completely back. The heavy steel door of his biometric floor safe was wide open. He had rushed in, pressed his thumb to the scanner, and found the steel box entirely empty. He realized someone had completely bypassed his infallible, arrogant security system. He realized the physical leather ledger and the highly encrypted secondary hard drive were completely gone. The reality of his total crushing vulnerability had driven him into a violent physical frenzy. His expensive tailored suit was ripped at the seams, his silk tie was missing, and his knuckles were actively bleeding from smashing the glass desk. He was a monster, fully unmasked. Then I saw her. Rachel was standing in the hallway just a few feet away from the office door. She had clearly heard the front door smash open and had run downstairs to see what was happening. She was completely frozen in place, her hands covering her mouth, staring in absolute paralyzing horror at the man she had married. She was looking at a rabid animal destroying our home, his face twisted in a mask of pure, ugly desperation. She did not understand the cartel blood money, the federal wire fraud, or the corrupted police raid. She only knew that the polished, loving husband she thought she knew was entirely a lie. Travis suddenly stopped tearing at the broken drywall. He heard Rachel let out a small, terrified gasp. He spun around, his bloodshot eyes locking instantly onto her frozen face, his panicked, desperate brain short-circuited. He did not see his loving wife. He saw physical leverage. He saw his only remaining ticket out of the country. He lunged across the ruined room with terrifying speed. Before Matthew could even raise his weapon from the end of the hallway, Travis grabbed Rachel violently by her arm. He yanked her hard against his chest, twisting her arm painfully behind her back to secure his grip. With his free hand, he reached into the waistband of his ruined trousers and pulled out the matte black, suppressed handgun I had seen him pack in the attic last night. He pressed the long cylindrical metal silencer directly against the side of Rachel's head. Rachel let out a muffled, terrified sob, her entire body shaking uncontrollably against him. Travis pressed his back against the broken office wall, using my daughter as a human shield. He scanned the hallway frantically, aiming the weapon wildly in every direction. He screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice completely raw, hoarse, and broken. He demanded to know where the old man was. He demanded to know where I had hidden his physical backup ledger. He squeezed Rachel's arm much tighter, making her cry out in sudden pain. He shouted that if he did not get the leather notebook back in exactly 60 seconds, he was going to pull the trigger and leave her bleeding on the floor. He viciously blamed her for everything, screaming that her family had set him up to take the fall for a massive international crime. Matthew stepped out from the dark shadows of the living room, leveling his federal weapon directly at Travis's chest. He ordered him to drop the gun immediately, his voice echoing with absolute trained authority. But a man actively facing a cartel death sentence does not care about federal authority. Travis just laughed, a manic, hysterical sound that chilled my blood, and pressed the gun harder against Rachel's temple. He yelled that federal agents do not shoot through innocent hostages. He was entirely right. Matthew was physically paralyzed, unable to take the shot without risking his sister's life. The situation had spiraled completely out of control. It was time for the architect to step back into the room. I pushed past Matthew's shoulder. I ignored my son's desperate, angry whisper to stay back. I stepped fully into the light of the hallway, standing completely out in the open. I was wearing my torn flannel shirt and my unlaced work boots. I held both of my hands high up in the air, showing him my completely empty palms. I was entirely unarmed. I looked past the black gun. I looked past my weeping daughter. I looked directly into the terrified, bloodshot eyes of the man who had tried to bury me. The silence in the hallway was absolutely deafening. I did not shout. I did not let a single ounce of fear enter my voice. I spoke with the cold, immovable weight of a falling anvil. I told him to let her go. I told him he did not need to hurt his wife because I had exactly what he was looking for. Travis leveled the heavy black weapon directly at the center of my chest. His hand was trembling so violently that the long, cylindrical metal silencer rattled against the broken pieces of drywall scattered behind him. He screamed my name, his voice completely fractured by raw panic and desperation. He told me to give him the physical ledger right this second, or he would kill both of us without hesitating. He was entirely capable of doing it. I looked at the dark, hollow barrel of the gun pointing at my heart. I did not raise my hands in surrender. I did not take a step backward. I did not beg for my life or plead for mercy. I relied on the exact same cold, calculated discipline I had used my entire professional career when dealing with a failing structure. I maintained direct, unwavering eye contact with the man who wanted to murder me. I needed to completely control the temperature of the room. I kept my voice dangerously calm, speaking with a slow, deliberate cadence. I forced him to focus entirely on my words, instead of his own spiraling terror. I told him he was acting like an absolute fool. I explained that I was not stupid enough to keep the only piece of evidence keeping me alive inside a house that was scheduled to be raided by corrupt police officers. I lied with absolute, unbreakable conviction. I told him the physical leather notebook and the highly encrypted secondary hard drive were currently sitting inside a heavily reinforced security locker at a private storage facility in the downtown financial district. I watched his bloodshot eyes widen as his brain desperately tried to process the information. He wanted to call my bluff, but he knew I was an engineer who planned for every possible contingency. I laid out his abysmal odds with brutal surgical clarity. I told him that if he pulled that trigger right now, he would die completely broke and entirely alone. I reminded him that the cartel bosses already knew he had stolen their $14 million. I told him that Matthew and the Federal Bureau of Investigation had intercepted the encrypted communications. Without the specific offshore routing numbers written in that ledger to buy his way out of the country, the syndicate mercenaries would hunt him down and skin him alive before midnight. I offered him a single, non-negotiable trade. I told him to let Rachel walk out the front door completely unharmed. In exchange for my daughter's safety, I would drive him directly to the downtown facility and hand over the security locker access code. Travis stood frozen against the ruined office wall. I could actually see the desperate calculations grinding behind his panicked eyes. He weighed his massive corporate ego against his primal animalistic fear of a brutal cartel execution. He looked down at my terrified daughter, who was still trembling violently against his chest, and then he looked back up at me. He realized I was the only person on Earth who held the absolute key to his survival. He could not torture the locker location out of me if the federal agents were swarming the property. He needed my willing cooperation. He made his choice. He violently shoved Rachel forward, pushing her away from him with so much force that she stumbled and nearly fell onto the carpeted floor. He screamed at her to get out of the house immediately and never look back. Rachel scrambled to her feet, tears streaming rapidly down her face. She looked at me, her eyes begging me to run out the door with her. I could not tell her that her brother was waiting just outside with a heavily armed federal tactical team. I offered her a single reassuring nod, silently promising her that everything would be over very soon. She turned and ran out the broken front door, disappearing into the safety of the afternoon sun. The heavy silence of the house settled over us once again. We were completely alone. Travis instantly closed the physical distance between us. He lunged forward and grabbed the back of my flannel shirt, twisting the thick fabric into a tight, aggressive fist. He pressed the hard, cold metal barrel of the suppressed handgun directly against the base of my spine. The weapon dug painfully into my vertebrae, sending a sharp jolt of adrenaline straight through my nervous system. He pushed me roughly forward, ordering me to march slowly down the hallway toward the garage. Every step we took through the house felt incredibly heavy. My mind was racing, anticipating his every possible erratic move. He stayed completely hidden behind me, using my body as a human shield to protect himself from the open living room windows. He was terrified that police snipers were watching from the street, waiting for a clear shot. His tactical paranoia was entirely justified, but it also made him incredibly dangerous. We walked past the shattered glass vase in the foyer, the remnant of my successful decoy play from earlier this afternoon. Travis kept cursing under his breath, muttering about how I had ruined his flawless digital empire. I did not respond. I simply kept walking toward the side door. We pushed through the heavy fireproof door and stepped out onto the cold concrete floor of the garage. The air was chilly and smelled strongly of old motor oil and damp cardboard. Travis shoved me hard against the side of my heavy work truck. He kept the gun pressed firmly into my back, the metal barrel bruising my skin through the shirt. He demanded the keys to my vehicle, threatening to shoot me directly in the kneecap if I tried anything stupid or tried to trigger the garage door opener prematurely. I reached into the front pocket of my denim jeans and slowly pulled out the metal keyring. I kept my movements smooth and highly predictable so I would not startle him into pulling the trigger. I handed the keys back to him over my shoulder. As he snatched the metal ring from my hand, I turned my head slightly and looked past his shoulder toward the messy pile of old painting supplies in the far corner of the garage. Sitting right on top of the dirty canvas drop cloths was the rusted sealed paint can. The physical leather ledger and the digital backup drive he was willing to commit murder for were resting exactly 3 feet away from his expensive leather shoes. He had absolutely no idea. He was sweating profusely, hyperventilating with panic, holding a gun to my spine to force me to drive him to a fictional locker across the city. The extreme irony of the situation was almost overwhelming. The arrogant corporate cleaner who thought he could outsmart the federal government and a ruthless criminal syndicate was completely blind to his immediate surroundings. He was forcing me to drive him straight into an inescapable federal snare, intentionally leaving his only possible salvation completely behind in a pile of rusted garbage. I opened the heavy driver's side door of my truck and climbed inside, ready to deliver him to his absolute ruin. I shifted the heavy transmission of my truck into reverse. The engine rumbled beneath my boots as I slowly backed out of my long driveway for what felt like the final time. Travis was sitting rigid in the passenger seat. He kept his body angled toward me. His right hand was completely steady now, holding the heavy black suppressed handgun directly against my lower ribs. I could feel the cold metal through the fabric of my torn flannel shirt. I steered the heavy vehicle out onto the quiet suburban street. The late afternoon sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the asphalt. I drove perfectly within the speed limit. I used my turn signals. I came to a complete stop at every single stop sign. I did not want to give any passing patrol car a reason to pull us over. A routine traffic stop right now would end in a violent bloodbath. We left the manicured lawns and quiet sidewalks of the neighborhood behind. I navigated the truck onto the main highway, heading toward the city limits. The atmosphere inside the cab of the truck was suffocating. The air conditioner was running on high, but Travis was sweating profusely. Thick drops of perspiration rolled down his pale face, soaking into the collar of his ruined custom dress shirt. He was constantly checking his side mirror and snapping his head around to look out the rear window. He was a man consumed by absolute paranoia. Every single car that merged behind us was a potential cartel hit squad. Every dark sport utility vehicle was a federal tactical team. He was jumping at shadows. His rapid, shallow breathing was the only sound competing with the hum of the tires against the road. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the road ahead. I drove us away from the commercial centers and steered the truck toward the desolate industrial district on the far outskirts of town. It was a sprawling wasteland of rusted chain-link fences, decaying brick factories, and empty shipping containers. It was the perfect place for a man to disappear. It was also the perfect place to spring a trap. Travis could not handle the heavy silence any longer. His massive ego demanded a target for his rage. He turned his head and glared at me. His voice was a harsh, venomous hiss. He told me I had ruined absolutely everything. He leaned closer, pressing the barrel of the gun harder into my side. He bragged that he had built a flawless financial system. He claimed his digital architecture was a masterpiece of modern accounting. He said he had spent years constructing an impenetrable firewall that no federal agency could ever breach. He blamed my interference for destroying a criminal enterprise that was completely foolproof. I kept my hands firmly gripped at the 10 and 2 positions on the leather steering wheel. I knew exactly what Matthew needed right now. Federal wire fraud cases are incredibly complex. They require mountains of digital evidence, but they also require undeniable intent. A sharp defense attorney might try to argue that Travis was coerced, or that he was unaware of the true nature of the funds he was moving. I needed to completely eliminate any possibility of a legal defense. I needed him to proudly claim ownership of his treason. I slid my left hand down the curve of the steering wheel. I reached my fingers into the dark space just beneath the plastic steering column. A month ago, Travis had insisted on upgrading my home internet. He did not know that my son Matthew had also made a small upgrade to my personal vehicle. I felt the small, raised plastic button hidden perfectly out of sight. I pressed it once. A tiny, invisible microphone embedded in the dashboard instantly activated. It was wired directly to a secure, encrypted federal frequency. Every single word spoken inside the cab of my truck was now broadcasting live to Matthew and his trailing tactical team. I took a deep breath and spoke with absolute, unwavering clarity. I made sure that my voice was loud enough for the hidden microphone to catch every single syllable. I told him he was completely delusional. I laid out the exact charges against him. I stated clearly that he had systematically laundered $14 million for the Los Zetas criminal syndicate. I told him he had intentionally used my name, my personal home address, and my legitimate retirement accounts to hide their extorted ransom money. I looked over at him for a brief second. I told him that was not a flawless digital system. I told him that was high-level federal treason. I threw the exact words he needed to hear to trigger his massive narcissism. I challenged his intellect. A smart criminal would have realized I was baiting him. A smart criminal would have kept his mouth shut and held his weapon steady. But Travis was not thinking like a survivor anymore. He was thinking like a humiliated corporate executive who desperately needed to prove he was the smartest man in the room. He could not stand the idea that an obsolete, retired old man was judging his masterpiece. Travis let out a sharp, arrogant laugh. It was a chilling sound that completely lacked any human empathy. He leaned back slightly against the passenger seat, his chest puffing out with twisted pride. He did not deny a single accusation. Instead, he eagerly embraced them. He looked directly at me and proudly admitted to everything. He loudly confirmed that he had moved every single penny of that $14 million for the syndicate. He bragged about how easily he had bypassed the international banking regulations. He gloated about manipulating my accounts, calling me a blind and gullible fool. He confirmed the exact name of the cartel he worked for, permanently cementing his guilt. Then he made his final fatal mistake. He clearly stated his entire malicious intent. He told me that his plan was always to use me as a disposable shield. He admitted that he planted the digital flash drive in my study this morning. He confirmed he arranged the corrupt local police raid. He stated with absolute terrifying confidence that when the federal government finally closed in, I was going to take the fall for his entire criminal empire. He promised me that I would die alone in a maximum security federal prison, while he lived out the rest of his life on a tropical beach. His full, unedited confession echoed loudly in the confined space of the truck cabin. I did not need to say another word. He had just handed the Federal Bureau of Investigation a pristine wrapped gift. He had confessed to massive wire fraud money laundering for a recognized international terrorist syndicate, elder abuse, and attempted murder. There was no defense attorney on the planet who could save him now. He had completely sealed his own fate. I turned the steering wheel sharply to the right. We left the main industrial road and slowly rolled onto a heavily cracked concrete driveway. Tall, rusted weeds pushed up through the broken pavement. We were entering the grounds of a massive abandoned textile warehouse. The towering brick building was completely covered in faded graffiti. The windows were shattered, and the massive loading dock doors were heavily chained shut. The lot was surrounded by a high chain-link fence topped with coils of sharp razor wire. It was completely isolated from the rest of the city. I brought the heavy truck to a slow, steady stop right in the middle of the empty lot. I shifted the transmission into park and turned the key, killing the engine. The sudden silence was absolute and heavy. Travis quickly scanned the deserted warehouse looking for the secure storage facility I had promised him. He frowned, his grip tightening on the black handgun. He demanded to know where the security lockers were. He asked why we were parked in an abandoned lot. He did not realize that the broadcast was over. He did not realize that his arrogant confession was the absolute final piece of the puzzle. I took my hands off the steering wheel and rested them quietly in my lap. I looked at the man who had tried to destroy my family, and I waited for the federal snare to violently snap shut. The dead silence of the abandoned industrial lot pressed down heavily against the windows of my truck. Travis sat frozen in the passenger seat, his knuckles completely white as he gripped the heavy, suppressed handgun. He looked out through the windshield at the towering, graffiti-covered brick walls of the empty textile warehouse. His paranoid brain was struggling to reconcile the desolate environment with his arrogant expectations. He turned to me, his eyes wide and completely bloodshot. He aggressively pressed the metal barrel of the weapon harder against my lower ribs. He demanded to know where the secure storage building was. He demanded to know why there were no armed guards, no security cameras, and no heavy reinforced steel doors. He shouted that I had taken a wrong turn and ordered me to put the truck back into drive immediately. He was completely trapped in his own frantic denial. I kept my hands perfectly still, resting them calmly on the leather steering wheel. I looked directly into his panicked face and told him I had driven him exactly where he needed to be. I told him there was no private security locker. I told him the physical ledger he desperately needed to buy his life back from the cartel was currently sitting inside a rusted paint can on the floor of my garage. The absolute shock of my revelation hit him like a physical blow. His jaw dropped and the breath hitched violently in his throat. He realized he had abandoned his only salvation. He realized his entire desperate hostage run was a complete, pathetic failure. He raised the gun, his face twisting into an ugly mask of pure homicidal rage. He screamed that he was going to blow my head off right here in the driver's seat. But before his trembling finger could even squeeze the trigger, the entire world outside the truck violently erupted into blinding light and deafening noise. The massive, rusted, corrugated steel doors of the loading dock directly in front of us did not just open. They completely exploded outward. A heavy armored federal breaching vehicle smashed right through the thick metal barricade, sending massive showers of orange sparks and shattered iron chains flying into the dark night sky. The deafening crash of tearing metal echoed like thunder across the empty concrete expanse. Before Travis could even turn his head to look, 6 more heavily armored, unmarked black tactical vehicles came tearing around the blind corners of the brick warehouse. They swarmed the desolate lot with terrifying synchronized precision. They slammed on their brakes perfectly, boxing my truck into an inescapable steel perimeter. Their heavy rubber tires screeched violently against the broken pavement, sending up thick clouds of white smoke. Massive high-powered tactical spotlights mounted on the reinforced roofs of the federal vehicles snapped on simultaneously. The blinding, concentrated white beams flooded the cabin of my truck, completely incinerating the evening shadows and turning the inside of the vehicle into agonizing daylight. Travis shrieked in sudden pain, dropping the hand holding the weapon and throwing his arm over his face to shield his eyes from the overwhelming glare. He pressed his back violently against the passenger door, desperately trying to make himself as small as humanly possible, but there was absolutely nowhere left to hide. The heavy steel doors of the surrounding tactical vehicles flew open. Dozens of highly trained federal agents wearing full protective body armor poured out onto the concrete. They moved with absolute silent efficiency, taking up fortified firing positions behind the heavy engine blocks of their trucks. I turned my head and looked over at the man who had tried to destroy my family. Through the blinding white light, I saw 3 distinct bright red laser dots appear directly on the center of his chest. They were perfectly visible right through the thin fabric of his ruined silk shirt. Federal snipers positioned on the warehouse roof had him completely locked in their sights. If he twitched his finger, if he raised his hand a single inch, he would be instantly neutralized. The intricate lethal trap I had designed was now fully sprung. A loud piercing electronic screech ripped through the air as a heavy megaphone was switched on. My oldest son Matthew stepped out from behind the lead armored breaching vehicle. His athletic frame was clad in heavy tactical gear, his federal badge shining brightly under the spotlights. He raised the megaphone to his mouth. His voice boomed across the empty industrial lot, amplified and echoing with absolute terrifying authority. He called Travis by his full name. He announced that the vehicle was entirely surrounded by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He ordered him to drop the weapon onto the floorboards immediately and place both hands flat against the glass of the windshield. He stated with cold clarity that any sudden movement, any hesitation, would be met with immediate and overwhelming lethal force. The psychological transformation of my son-in-law was absolute, immediate, and incredibly pathetic. The highly polished, arrogant corporate mastermind completely evaporated into thin air. The ruthless cartel cleaner who bragged about washing millions of dollars vanished entirely. The man sitting next to me was nothing but a broken, terrified coward facing the absolute ruin of his entire existence. His fingers went completely limp. The heavy black suppressed handgun slipped from his sweaty grip and dropped onto the rubber floor mat with a dull, harmless thud. Travis completely collapsed forward, burying his flushed face in his hands. He began sobbing uncontrollably. His entire body shook with violent, racking gasps that echoed loudly in the confined space of the cabin. He reached out with his bare, bleeding hands and desperately grabbed the sleeve of my torn flannel shirt. He looked at me with tears streaming down his face. He cried out my name, begging me to tell the federal agents it was all a massive misunderstanding. He pleaded with me to save him from federal prison. He swore he would give all the cartel money back. He frantically promised he would leave the state, change his name, and never come near my daughter again if I just helped him get away. He was bargaining with a man whose life he had actively tried to destroy just a few hours ago. I looked down at his shaking hands gripping my sleeve. I felt absolutely nothing for him. I felt no pity. I felt no sympathy. I felt no regret. I had warned Rachel that men who care too much about how their shoes shine often care very little about the people they step on. He had stepped on me, expecting me to quietly crumble under his weight. I reached down and physically peeled his sweating fingers off my clothing. I tossed his hand away as if it were a piece of rotting garbage. I reached over and pressed the unlock button on the driver's side door. I grabbed the heavy plastic door handle and pulled it open. The cool, crisp night air rushed into the suffocating, sweat-filled cabin of the truck. I stepped out onto the broken concrete. I turned around and looked back inside the vehicle one final time. I looked at the pathetic, sobbing mess of a man who had tried to steal my wealth, my freedom, and my home. I spoke my final words to him clearly, making absolutely sure he heard every single syllable over the sounds of the shouting federal agents closing in. I told him he had tried to bury me inside my own home. I told him to enjoy his new cage. I slammed the heavy truck door shut, permanently sealing him inside his own self-made tomb. Federal tactical agents immediately swarmed the passenger side of the vehicle. They yanked the door open, reached inside, and grabbed Travis by his ruined suit jacket.